All right. Hello, friends. I have a question for you. Have you ever walked into something and you thought, man, I think I bit off a little bit more than I can chew? I think I committed to something I am not quite ready for. I want to tell you that is a little bit how I feel today on day 5 because I don't know how to capture and package up and a short version of all the things that we need to get through from Moses in the wilderness to the story of Ruth, but I'm going to give it a try. And I want to let you know that I think that might be a little bit how the Israelites felt like as well. So let's think about what happened yesterday and where we left off. They're in the wilderness. They are hungry. They are feeling like, I'm not sure if we should have left Egypt. This is harder than I thought it would be. We want the promised land and we don't have it yet. And then now we find that the story of Ruth takes place once the Israelites get into the promised land. So, one of the key areas, we're actually skipping over a good amount, but one of the key books that we're skipping over is the book of Judges. And if you scroll down into the extras and check that out within this 10-day devotional, you will see there is a great video on the book of Judges that can do way more justice than I ever could to kind of capture where we are, because the book of Ruth and the story of Ruth takes place during that time frame. But there is one judge that I want to talk about. So you probably have heard, if you grew up in church at all, you've probably heard of Gideon, you've probably heard of Samson, but there was actually a judge named Deborah. And the first time I ever learned about Deborah, it was actually through this child book. So this is a book, it's called The Bible Bells, and they're committed to bringing biblical stories of women to young ladies through child stories, through children's books. And literally, I was reading with my daughter and I was like, oh, Deborah seems pretty awesome. I had never seen her in the Bible. And there's a lot of stories like that that we overlook. And so I don't want to go through a massive retell of Deborah, but I want to just focus on a few key areas. The first thing is that she was a prophetess and she was a judge. So she was a leader in the land as a female. She was married, but she still held her own role and her own responsibility. And there was a military commander named Barak. He reported into her and he came to her one day and he said, there's trouble happening. And she said, you have to go fight. And he said, I will go fight, but I won't go alone. I need you to come with me. And we don't really see Deborah hesitate or pause. She makes very quick decisions and she's super assertive. She says, okay, I'll go with you, but I want you to know when they are delivered over to us, because we will win. When that happens, you will not get credit. The credit will go to a woman. And you may be thinking that she's talking about herself, but this is actually an area of scripture where we see women honoring women. And she actually knows that there's another woman that's going to be honored here. And that's a woman by the name of Jael. And Jael is in a tent, and Sisera, who is the bad guy, comes and he needs shelter. And she says, go ahead and come in. And she ends up killing him with a tent peg. And so the Bible is gory. It's really easy to think it's boring, but it's not. It's like a big soap opera, because really humans are complicated and we lean on the flesh and we lean on our own desires. And we see two women here really taking charge. We see people following in under their leadership, male or female. In a very patriarchal society, they're leaning into her leadership. And because of that, Israel had peace for 40 years. And so it's beautiful when you're going through scripture and you see people that it's like, you know what? I feel like I'm a little bit of a fish out of water. I feel like I'm a little bit out of place, or I don't know if anyone has ever gone through this struggle or this burden that I'm carrying. But we see examples like that all throughout the Bible. And if you guys remember from day one, when we talked about Eve, we talked about a woman being created in Genesis 2:18 as a helper suitable. And what Deborah was is she was uniquely created to be a leader during this time. And I just want to propose to you that you probably are too. You are probably uniquely gifted to take on the call that God has given you. So let's talk about Ruth and what you read about today. Ruth was a Moabite, okay, and so how she gets into Scripture and what takes place is there is a famine in the land. And Naomi, who is an Israelite, moves to a foreign country with her husband. Now, the land of Moab was actually generated from back in Genesis. And we see it actually created a little bit out of sin. Again, here's a little bit more drama for your soap opera and your telenova. There were two daughters that basically took advantage of their dad, and one of them got pregnant. And yeah, took advantage of them that way. And one of them got pregnant, and that son was named Moab. And eventually they moved to the land of Moab. And so the Moabites were considered foreigners. And so when Naomi and her husband moved there with their family, their kids, their sons, marry foreigners, which, by the way, just, God didn't really like that. At that time, God felt like you were setting yourself up for a situation to take your eyes off of him. But it doesn't matter. We see over and over again in Scripture, God using whatever humans do for his good, just like we saw in the story of Joseph, right? What you meant for harm, God used for good. And that's what we see happen here. And so the two sons and Naomi's husband all pass away. I just want you to think about this story. Real people, real women who all three of them just lost their husbands. And, I don't know if you're a widow. I don't know if you know a widow, but there's a lot of women out there that have lost the love of their lives, and they're left feeling desolate and sad. And I think sometimes, at least I know I did, when I would hear about Ruth, I would think that it's just this sweet, beautiful story, this love story of Ruth finding love. But in reality, what happens is it's a woman in pain. It is multiple women in pain. And so Naomi says, I need to go back to my land. You guys stay here in your land, the land of Moab. Don't worry about me. I'll be okay. And one of the daughter-in-laws chooses to stay, but Ruth decides to go. And again, I think sometimes we think of Ruth as just this sweet and, flowers all around her, but she was a woman who took action. She was brokenhearted. She was bold. She decided to leave the land that she knew to go to follow her mother-in-law, to move to another land with another religion and follow Yahweh. And she converted, and she learned the Scripture, and she learned the law, and she took risk, and she took action, and ultimately she was redeemed. And so what we see is Ruth is in the field gleaning. So if you go back to those books of the law with Deuteronomy and Leviticus, there are sections in there where God says part of the law was to protect the widows and to protect the poor. And he tells the people, I want you to leave extra grain so people that need it can go, they can glean the field. And that's what Ruth was doing. And she was out there and she was working hard when she met Boaz. And ultimately she meets Boaz. He sees her as a hard worker, and she takes a couple of risks that when you read about it could seem a little bit risque. But ultimately, in the law, there is this protection around a redeemer kingsman, or a kingsman redeemer. And she approaches Boaz and says, more or less, will you be my husband? That's not how it really happened. I wouldn't check me on Scripture there. This is, would you be my redeemer? And he goes and he battles for her, and ultimately that's what takes place. Ultimately, they do fall in love, and it is a very beautiful love story. And so I just want to share with you one other aspect that I think is so gorgeous. So, in the New Testament, there is genealogy that goes all the way back to Abraham. And filtered throughout this genealogy are women. There are women who were prostitutes. There are women who didn't make great decisions. And also, there are humans that didn't make great decisions, like Judah. So when we learned about Leah and Rachel, we learned that Rachel had Joseph. We've already talked about that story, and Leah had Judah. And that ultimately led to the genealogy of David, who we're going to learn about tomorrow, who ultimately led to the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so as we move in tomorrow, what happens is Boaz and Ruth have a baby, and that baby ultimately leads to King David, and that's who we're going to learn about tomorrow. So I'm so glad that you're sticking with us. I'm excited to see you on day 6, and keep being in the Word daily. I promise you, it will transform your life.